Hey, there we go. Had some interesting thoughts for a show tonight. Something a little different, something a little more interactive. I mentioned it briefly on the Facebook page. We can get into that a little more in a bit. Want to talk about, based on last week's Stress for Lounge, where we got into a bit of heated argument about what America's role in the world should be. I thought it'd be fun to sort of interact with the comment sections both on YouTube and Twitch, and see if we couldn't. We're never going to agree on anything, but at the very, very least, I'll give you an idea of what I think America is and what I think its role in the world should be. And we can do this with live feedback, and then we'll jump into the questions. Let's just see real quick in other news. I have a wall painted black here. The So I painted the wall flat black because I could have done story mechanics in front of a green screen and just keyed myself, and then put the stuff I want in the background, but that always looks digital. And so what I decided to do was, since I have a whole open space over there, I painted that wall black. I've got a mechanized screen that's going to come down. I got a laser projector, and I'm going to be able to project the story mechanics sort of background on that wall. And I can also put individual clips on that wall. I've got a switcher thing that I've had for a while now, delayed as usual. And I've got a neon sign that's sitting here. And when I did a test on it, it was throwing light off the screen, plus the lights. The main problem was the lights that we're using to light me, soft box lights, were showing up on the back wall. So we are going to, so I thought, oh, I'll paint the wall black, fantastic. And then I remembered that after I painted it black, I put three coats of flat black on there, and it looked really nice. It's kind of real dark gray. But there's something out there. I remember seeing an ad for it on Facebook, and it was one of those things I bid on. 1 second. Because it just impressed me. And what it was a form of super black paint, and this particular brand that I got is called Black 4.0. And Black 4.0 absorbs something like 99.4% of all the light that hits it. So I bought some for Natasha because she's an artist, and it's not just black paint. It's eerie. It's like somebody cut a hole in something. Castellan mentions Ventablack. I think it was based on Ventablack. In fact, I think there's a little bit war of the super black paints going on, like a personal thing. Decided I'm not going to get involved in that. But I had this wall that's painted black, and I had I wish I could give it to you in real measurements, but it turns out I only got the metric. I had 150 milliliters of it, and I put that on a roller and painted an area about the size of two pizza boxes. And I put the super black on top of the flat black, and it is black. I ordered the 2 liters of super black to do the whole wall. That was on May 2nd. Still hasn't gotten here, so I sent them an email asking them what the heck is the holdup and where's my super black. Here's the reason I like this idea, because part of the thing, as I said, I could have very easily just keyed this in behind me, but that looks digital, and I really like the idea of having an open space with the cutouts of the people that I'm going to be talking about, kind of like these two guys right here. It's just different. Now these guys get lost against all the clutter in the background, but if the background behind me here was just like super black, it'd be almost like Night Gallery, which would be pretty cool if you think about it. So I'm waiting for that, and we'll get that baby going as fast as we can. Also had some thoughts. I know these are more kind of, I did use regular paint as primer. Joseph, I put 3 coats of matte black down. I went to Home Depot. I said, give me the flattest, blackest matte black you got. I put 3 coats down, and it looked really nice. And then I put the super black over it, and I thought, ooh, I thought it was black before, but this stuff is amazing. Coincidentally, I've used that term super black, and I realized where I got it from. It's a 3D rendering term. I used it a lot in 3D Studio. So if you had say you had a crescent moon or something against a star field. And you wanted that crescent moon to be black on the night side, like there's no ambient light at all. You could render something called super black, which would mean that 0 pixels is transparent, and that way even something that looks completely black cuts a hole out of the stars rather than the stars filling in the crescents along the radio. It doesn't matter. So I was thinking about that, and then the other thing I was thinking about is what to do with the look of things to come. I don't want to just sit here and read it into camera. I don't want it to look like a firewall or an afterburner, but I get the only advertising I see. Black 4.0 it's called. It's amazing. You can see when they paint something like a 3D object black, and when you rotate it, it's like it disappears. It's really astonishing. So I'm waiting for that to show up. The only ads I see these days come to me on Facebook, and I don't do a lot of Facebook interactions. I never ever use Facebook Messenger or anything, but every now and then I scroll past an ad for something, and I saw something I liked a lot because I've had problems with it in the past. And what it is basically is I want to say it's about 8 foot tall, maybe, by maybe 4 foot wide. And it's one of these soft things that unfolds the way that sometimes those tents will. It's got wires, and you bend it, and it just folds up in a little spot, and it comes up. It's about a little under $500. And what it is a 8 foot by 4 foot green screen, but most importantly, it's illuminated from the inside, which means that the problem with green screens traditionally, and when I did all the firewalls and afterburners and all that stuff, you're trying to light me, but the lights are throwing shadows on the green screen. You have to have an entire set of lights to light the green screen. You can't use green cloth, by the way. This chroma key green is a special fabric. It's kind of a foam fabric, so it doesn't wrinkle, and it is monochrome. There's just one color there. But the problem is that when you light the person in front of the green screen, that person will almost always throw a shadow on the green screen. So now you have to key out the green, and you also have to key out kind of that gray where the shadow is. And this guy who was making the sale on this thing, and it looks like he made a sale, I haven't bought it yet, but I probably will, said the thing about this backlit green screen is, yes, you will occasionally see a shadow on it, but the shadow has green light information. The shadow has there's green light coming out from behind the shadow, so it keys, and he showed some examples, and the key is just brilliant. So I was kind of thinking about doing that for things to come. There's also been a number of ads that I've seen that are real quick and easy special effects. So here's 400 explosions, and it's just a transparent layer. You just drop it into Final Cut or drop it into After Effects, including a number of backgrounds. And I kind of like the idea of doing this in because you can make the key look really pretty good. Maybe not feature film good, but good enough to believe that you're standing in this, different scenes. So I think what I'll do is I'll probably do each episode in front of a different background like that, and I'll find a standard dress. I'm kind of inclined to want to go with Rod Serling black suit, white shirt, black tie thing, and give it a look for that. But this did I see Corridor? My Russia Dark says, see Corridor crew rediscovered Disney's amber screen effect. I did not see that. That's kind of cool. Who would have thought? I opened that link so I can watch that later. Thank you for that, Marusha. And thanks for everything, obviously. So anyway, so there's that. And this backlit thing really does give you a super clean key and give me a chance to do something that looks different. That's very important, that I look different. So we got that going. One other thing. What was it? It'll come to me eventually. Yeah. All right. So those are just some housekeeping details. So I'm kind of letting the YouTube viewership build up a little bit. We're at 66 now, and I expect we generally get around 100. So I'll just kind of song and dance my way through another minute or two, and then we'll get down to this topic, which I think is interesting. Let's see, what else have we got? My segment on Right Angle this week is about, it's ostensibly about manta ray, which is a I think it's a Northrop Grumman drone. It's an autonomous underwater vehicle, and it is huge. It's like this. It looks like the flying sub. It looks just delta-shaped thing. It's like winged, and the idea behind it is you get these manta rays, and they you make a few of them. I don't know, a couple hundred, and you basically these things just swim out into the ocean, and then they just float down, sink down to the bottom, and they sit there and wait for a bad guy submarine to go by. And they're not only sensor platforms; they can track the target and presumably suicide against the target. And it's not the term that I used for the thumbnail. The term that I heard with regard to these things is attritable assets, meaning things that you can afford to lose. The Air Force is dealing with this as well. The idea is that certainly F-22s and F-35s have the data link, but the next generation air dominance fighter, the idea would be you don't have to build 700 of these things or 1,000 of them. You build 200 of these things, and then you build 1,000 drones, which the Air Force is just generally calling the loyal wingman. And these drones range in price from price of an inexpensive jet down to the price of an expensive missile. And you basically fly into combat. Instead of one jet going in, it's one jet and 8 drones. And then obviously this is done with mission planning before the mission, but then the drones go in, and the drones go in and basically take out the air defenses and strike ground targets, and the anti-air targets. And the pilot essentially is kind of it's like a forward controller on the scene. The drone's doing all the work, and the attritable aspect of it is you can send drones places where you wouldn't want to send human pilots, because if they get shot down, it's not cheap, but it's not the cost of an F-35 or an F-22 or an NGAD, and most importantly, you don't have to go in and get the guy. So I think this drone warfare thing is the future, and it might be the answer to the shortage of Navy hulls that we have. Sometimes I just get gut instincts on things, just reactions on things. I remember several weeks ago we talked about this on a right angle. 26 is the new 13, where observations from the James Webb Telescope indicated that light behaved differently at the beginning of the universe, had different speed, and that the universe is not symmetrical. So all the redshift information that we've been basing our cosmology on for well over 100 years is accurate now, but wasn't. When you wind the clock back, you assume that the speed of light is constant, but maybe it wasn't. Looks like perhaps it wasn't. And so basically what they were saying is that the universe might not be 13.5 billion years old, might be 26.5 billion years old. And the astrophysicists said, if that's true, you don't need dark matter, you don't need dark energy, you don't have to account for the fact that most of the universe is unobservable. If the universe is that old, then the expansion makes perfect sense. And I said to myself, well, that means that it must be true then. The thing I seem to learn about science is that the more simple and elegant an explanation or an equation is, the closer it is to being truth. And you're not going to do much better than E equals MC squared for the key to the universe, and that's a pretty simple equation. So sometimes I just get a gut feeling like that, and when I heard about this, I thought I'd bet a significant amount of money that this is true because it feels true. It cleans up a lot of messy things, and I felt that way when I started looking into this drone warfare, where the answer may not be that we need a 400 ship navy, but we might have a 4,000 vessel navy, and that has the ring of truth to it about the future. I'll get into Ukraine and all the rest of this in just a minute when we start this topic, but one of the things that I've seen from Ukraine, we saw early on in the beginning of the war, first couple weeks of the war, we saw these off-the-shelf, just drones, kind of thing you buy on Best Buy or whatever, dropping explosives down the hatches of tanks and taking out armored personnel vehicles. And what I've seen recently is really horrific, honestly. I look at a lot of horrific stuff. The what seems to be the case now is that now that the lines have stabilized and all these forces are stabilized, and the Russians seem to be catching up on this drone thing, and both sides now are at the point where they're using suicide drones not to take out a personnel carrier, but suicide drones to take out individual soldiers. I've seen a lot of videos from theater where you've got a drone that's basically holding 2 hand grenades, and it just drops one in front of a guy who's either in a trench or walking, one guy down a trail, and that usually is enough to knock him over, and then they drop another one near his head. And it's a special kind of horrifying, I would imagine. I'd still rather be in fighting in Ukraine today than I would in World War I in the Western Front in those trenches. But there's something horrific about guided hand grenades that see you wherever you are, and not only see you, but when you get into a dugout or undercover, at least in the First World War, if you went into an underground dugout, you had a good chance to survive a shelling unless you took a direct hit, but it would generally protect you. Nowadays, these things just fly into these dugouts and explode. And occasionally you'll see some soldier on either side, and that's the thing about the Ukraine War too, is you often can't tell them apart. They're just using the same gear, same uniforms. But you'll see some guy with an AK shooting at the drone, and I'm thinking to myself, son, you need a shotgun is what you need. You need a shotgun. You all need shotguns, which I would imagine would probably be pretty effective in the short range in the trenches anyway. But we're going to be dealing with drones, and the problem and the appeal of drones is you launch 200 of them at an American carrier group, and if 10 of them get through, you sink. And I've seen Russia's lost the Moscow because of surface-to-surface missiles that were apparently distracted by drones. The Moscow radar operators were distracted by drones. The Ukrainians flew some drones to the other side and pulled their attention, and meanwhile their anti-ship missiles came in and sank it. But I've seen at least 2 or 3 good-sized Russian ships, destroyer-sized, frigate-sized ships, that have been sunk by surface drones. It's just like a guy at the park with his remote-controlled boat. It's a little bit bigger than that, and they just zoom around and fly it in. You see all these splashes where the guys are trying to machine gun it and drive this thing right into the side of a ship and sink the ship for the cost of what, a couple $1,000, $10,000, $20,000. You can sink a frigate or a destroyer. This is a problem for us in the United States because it is a very asymmetric weapon in terms of its cost. And I've done a lot of Navy simulations, and I used to be concerned about, incoming 40 or 50 hypersonic missiles, but now I'm more worried about 2,000 incoming drones. So it's good to know that the Defense Department seems to be ahead of this, and while the rest of the government continues to get worse and worse and worse, somebody's thinking ahead, and companies like Anduril and Hermione and so on are little American startup defense companies that look like they're looking to the future. So we'll take that. Okay, I guess we'll get to the topic. So let me tell you what I was thinking about. I've been thinking about it a fair amount during the last week, and I thought about it a lot today. So I'd like this to be kind of a conversation with the comment sections here. I got to look at both of them. So last week we got on the subject of Ukraine, and I supporting Ukraine. I'm in favor of a policy of supporting Ukraine. And one thing we're going to do today is we're going to stay nice and calm, and we're going to have a rational discussion, and we're going to assume that everybody is speaking from a position of goodwill. So let me basically tell you why I would classify myself, if you want to call me an interventionist, that's fine. But I'll tell you what my personal position is. My personal position. And everybody's got their own personal position. When you get right down to it, if you ask every single person large numbers of questions. Everybody's a political party of one. Everybody is slightly different on something. So the question is, what can we agree upon? What can people who call themselves conservatives agree upon, and at the very least have the discussion, help us understand what the heck we're talking about and what we believe. So I started thinking about this. So here we go. 12 years ago, I did my first video collection called What We Believe. And episode 5 of that 6-episode series was called American Exceptionalism. And in American Exceptionalism, I argued that there were 4 metrics that you could use to describe a country's performance. Its economic might, its military might, its scientific achievements, and its cultural reach. And I went through the video and proceeded to show, with a great deal of evidence, that the United States is uniquely dominant in all 4 of those areas at the same time. And that's never happened in history. Uniquely dominant. And while China's total economy has grown since that, and perhaps, although I think China's headed for a gigantic collapse, and even if they surpass our GDP, which I find unlikely, frankly, but we're still saying that a country, the United States, has a quarter of the population of China, and we produce, at the time, 4 times what they produce. Now it's probably more like twice, but that's exceptional. Again, some of the stuff has eroded since 2010, but at the time I did it, if you take a look at the 50 top grossing movies of all time, all 50 of them are made with American studios involved, and all 50 of them are in English. That goes for music and our influence around the world as well. I did a look at the total number of scientific citations in terms of publications where a research paper has been cited. And I think the second, and I'm pulling these numbers completely out of my head, but the second was Great Britain with 81 or something, and or 81,000, and the United States had 263, so something like that. So scientifically, and so economically, and finally militarily, obviously, we outspend, and I'm certainly convinced we can outfight the next 10 armies in the world combined. The 3 largest air forces in the world, I think, are certainly the 3 most effective air forces in the world. Would be the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, and the United States Marine Corps. So there's that. So it is an exceptional country, and there's no question about it. And anybody who wants to argue otherwise is going to argue against a very, very, very big factual background. I remember during that segment, one of the things that I talked about was, speaking of technology, I said, let's look at inventions. So I went to the YouTube page, the Wikipedia page of the example that's held up for socialism. Sweden, this is as good as socialism gets. And looked for Swedish inventions. And since the beginning of the 20th century, the 2 major Swedish inventions have been the spherical bearing and the kidney dialysis machine. Then I went to look at the U.S. inventions, and it's, 11 pages. And I just had to select, I just didn't have the time. Lasers, aircraft, personal computers, just down the list. So we're an exceptional country. And so, based on the conversation we had last week, does that exceptionalism, which I'm going to consider to be an asset, does it come with any liabilities? Is there a concomitant responsibility that comes with that bounty, which is not luck? We earn it. The thing that makes America unique and so remarkable in all of those areas, I'm not one of these people who's saying that diversity is our strength by any means, but I am saying that the ability to argue and have discussions is a big part of it, but mostly it's this kind of rebelliousnness, this kind of idea that, hey, I've got this great idea and I took it to the boss and the boss laughed me out of the mailroom, so I'm going to go start my own business, and they do it, and then they put the boss out of business. Most of the time they do it and they end up going back to work for the guy, but Obviously, that kind of thing happens. We talked about these independent little defense companies like Anduril, which are doing amazing things, and just a bunch of guys, a bunch of engineers just got together and formed a company, and that's not happening anywhere else in the world. SpaceX is inconceivable in China, or Russia, or France, or any other. It's a uniquely American thing. So we have this rebelliousness and a orneriness that creates a lot of heat, and this interaction of ideas like a star. This is the outward explosion of energy, and the inward force that holds it together, the gravitational force that holds the star together, was at one time a common vision of America and a belief in American exceptionalism and a love for America. A lot of people have different opinions about what America was, but up until recently, most people would say they loved America. They just maybe disagreed with certain elements of it. Now, when you poll Gen Zers, it's something like 24% or 14% say they're very proud to be Americans. And that's catastrophic. First of all, it's a lie. The statistic's not a lie, but the facts they've been fed are a lie. And a trip overseas would cure them of a lot of these ideas. Even a trip overseas to the best places. When I went to, it's a brief aside, but it bears mentioning. So when you say, these kids, if they only went somewhere else, if they went to Mogadishu or something, they'd appreciate how great things are in America. That's true. If they went to China, they'd appreciate how great things in America. And I realized if they went to Stockholm or Oslo, they'd appreciate how great things are in America too, and in a very unusual way. I flew to Norway in 2018. I spent 5 days in Oslo. And the thing that struck me, and the thing that I like very much about Oslo, and it was also true in Stockholm Airport where I had a layover, was you could walk inside those airports, and not only was it spotlessly clean, but it was absolutely quiet. Absolutely quiet. Everybody was sitting there quietly, reading or speaking in very very low tones, and I realized that these social justice warriors who want this who want this socialist vision that they have in Scandinavian countries, these people can't shut up for 5 minutes. And you may ask what the two things have to do with each other, but the reason that socialist states work to the degree that they do work, and they don't work, which is why they have to import more Swedes and more Norwegians, and we see where that's going. But to the degree that they ever worked at all, was predicated on having a very virtuous, educated, respectful society, and none of these social justice warriors would be able to sit still at an airport and for an hour and not start listening to their music or arguing or talking loud or whatever. They just don't have the discipline for it. So all of this to say, we're in a unique situation here, and one of the things that makes us unique is it doesn't just make us unique in terms of like factually unique. It makes us morally unique. Is that nobody's from here. Even the Indians who claim to be from here came from somewhere else. And if you take a look at someplace like, I think I did this with Lubbock, Texas in the What We Believe series. If you decide you're going to return Lubbock, Texas to the Mexicans, and before you give it to the Mexicans, you have to give it to who owned it first, which was prior, which would have been the Confederacy, and prior to that it was the Republic of Texas, and prior to that it was Mexico, but prior to Mexico it was Spain, prior to that it was France, prior to that it was Spain again, then prior to that it was various Indian tribes, the Comanche and the Apache, you go all the way back to Piltdown Man or something, and so we are this country is people all around the world. And the idea of the melting pot that has worked so well for us until the progressives got a hold of it, tried to turn it into a series of small little tribes. The idea of the melting pot is, yes, you come over and you bring your culture with you, bring your food and your music and all the rest of it, but you assimilate into a larger culture. You influence that culture by bringing your culture with you, but you abandon that culture, bring it with you, and you become part of this you become new people. When my wife raised her right hand and swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States, became a U.S. citizen, she didn't stop becoming Russian, but she became a new person, and she's as American as I am or anybody else is. Thank you again for that super chat. And I'll come back to that if you don't mind. I don't want to lose this train of thought. Thank you very much, though. 99.99 super chat. It's astonishing. Thank you. So when people, like, sometimes you'll hear the Brits say, well, America was late to World War I or late to World War II, and my response to that would be, well, we're late to the scene of those fights the same way a policeman is late to the scene of a murder. It's not our fight. And when you hear, like, well, how come America didn't just leap into World War I on the side of the Entente, on the side of Britain and France? It's a significant, huge portion of our population is German. This is what I mean by morally unique. If you give up your previous allegiances, this theory is that you should be able to open up an Indian restaurant next to a Pakistani restaurant, and the two guys could be in competition for business without killing each other. You're supposed to leave all that stuff behind. So the moral difference between America is, while America certainly is its own entity, its own political entity, it is a political entity that is made up of a population that comes from everywhere. So if you say America goes around invading countries and doing nothing but knocking over regimes, we'll get to that in a minute. But at the very least, you're invading a country which has a significant number of American citizens from that country. That's why e pluribus unum is so important. It's out of many one. It's not out of many many, and it's not out of many a few. It's out of many one. You would basically prize your American identity above the ones you left behind. And prior to the very modern era, when immigrants came to America, it was the immigrant generation, the people that had lived in the old world and come to the new world. They were the ones who were most determined that their children fit in to the American system. If you look at the Italian immigration, for example, in the 1900s, you found that it was the Italian parents that insisted that their children speak English, and speak English in the house. They didn't want them to be Italian Americans, they wanted them to be Americans. And it's worked really well for virtually all of our history, and then people are starting to dismantle it. So what does that mean to the world? And when we got into this discussion about America's role in the world, and people are saying we're not the world's policeman, and I'm speaking for myself here. We'll get a conversation going in a minute, but speaking for myself here, I'm kind of I heard that and I said, well, we kind of are. And then you would ask yourself, well, why the hell would we be? I mean, there's no win in this. It's like my feeling on this is, well, being a policeman is not a pleasant job. It's a necessary job, and if you don't have a policeman, then you have anarchy. The idea that if you took America out of the world stage and just became completely isolationist, gave up patrolling the world's ocean and getting involved with anything, the idea that the world would just reach a kind of a happy balance without America there just doesn't seem to have any historical basis. Power abhors a vacuum. So you're either going to have good policemen, or you're going to have bad policemen, or you're going to have no policemen. And of those three, I'd rather have the good policeman. I think America's moral goodness, despite all of the, times we backed up on our word and mistakes we made and so on, I think America's moral standing as a world power it's not impeccable, it's not perfect, but it is unmatched. And it's very, very, very far ahead of any other competitor. The example I used in the What We Believe series is, at the end of World War II, we had atomic weapons, and we had fleets of B-29 bombers, and we had a Navy with 33 aircraft carriers in it. This is what we looked like in September of 1945. And we could have, at that time, put our flag anywhere. We could have taken any country we wanted and done the whole empire thing. There's nothing that could have stopped us. We had bombers that could fly anywhere around the world, and we had nuclear weapons, and we could have put the American flag anywhere we wanted, and nobody could have done a damn thing about it. And I cannot think of a country that has preceded us as a great power, including the one that immediately preceded us, Great Britain, that wouldn't have done that. But America didn't. In fact, America did the exact opposite. The second that that war was over, America started scrapping its ships and cutting up its airplanes to make them into beer cans, and turned 33 aircraft carriers into razor blades, and had the biggest disarmament in the world. When people criticize American military might, they'll say, well, what about Vietnam? Well, what about Vietnam? Let's go back to what Vietnam was. Historically, factually, the truth. Vietnam was divided in half because of the line where the Allied troops, meaning British, American, mostly American, but British, American, to some degree French troops, where they met Soviet troops. So the Iron Curtain in Europe was where the Red Army met the Western Allies. The dividing line in Vietnam was where the advancing Americans met the descending Soviets. Same thing for Korea, and so on. So since World War II, we've been involved in the Korean War. And the Korean War was not started by America. The Korean War was started by communists who wanted to take over the entire Korean peninsula, launched an attack, pushed the South Korean government right out of the fight, and pushed the Americans down to a small corner in Busan, I think it was, before the counterattack and so on. And then we actually took Pyongyang pretty easily, went further north, the Chinese got involved, and we ended up back where we started from. But that wasn't a win, but in terms of like an outright victory like World War II. But stay with me here, because I can't really get into the subject today without dealing with how we got here. But the overall objective was to stop communist aggression in Korea. And we did exactly that. And Seoul, Korea now is one of the most advanced cities in the world. Pyongyang is probably the single poorest large city on the planet. Everybody's seen the satellite images of the Korean Peninsula, where there's the border, and down below everything's brilliantly lit, especially Seoul, and everything north of that is dark except for a little speck of light where Pyongyang is. So we didn't start that fight, but we did finish the fight based on what our objectives were, which was to push the communist aggression back behind the line. We didn't take the territory. We could have, but we didn't. Let 10, 15 years go by, and the exact same thing happens in Vietnam, where the communist North invades the South. The South is a corrupt country, no question, like Ukraine, extremely corrupt country. All sorts of political favoritism going on. They are not Jeffersonian Republicans. They're not any of those things, but they were, number one, not communist. Number two, independent sovereign countries, and number three, had at least the veneer of democracy there, and the potential to achieve that kind of thing, which they've now achieved. Now, Vietnam is going to be taking over virtually all of the manufacturing in China, and if these Vietnamese had just been a little smarter, 40, 50 years ago, we could have saved a whole lot of lives. But they were fighting tooth and nail against the free market that they're now using to finally prosper. But again, what was the mission objective of the Vietnam War was to stop this invasion from the north. And when the United States ended that war in 1972, we had achieved that objective. I'm not splitting hairs here, and I'm not gilding a lily, but at the end of the Vietnam War, we won the Vietnam War. It was the worst fought war we ever had, by far, but we won the war, because the objective was to stop the invasion of the South and the takeover of the entire Vietnamese peninsula. We lost the peace the following year in 1973 after Watergate and the Democrats swept the tower, went back on their agreements with South Vietnam. North Vietnam started poking South Vietnam. We didn't respond, and so they finally just went and rolled it, and we just sat there and watched it. Okay. So I look at America's role in the world from two different lenses. I look at it from the lens of history, where I try to be as unbiased as possible and simply look at the laboratory of human behavior. The history is the laboratory of human behavior. We don't get to experiment on humans. We don't get to run simulations of how societies would behave. We don't get to know what would have happened if we hadn't gone into Vietnam, for example. We just don't know. We never will know. But we can look at what we've done in the past, what the outcome has been, and much more importantly, what other nations have done and what those outcomes have been. Because this stuff, the stuff that we're made out of, this doesn't change. Humans have been the same for no less than 250,000 years. We have the same desires, we have the same greed, same territorial ambitions, the same love for defense, we're the same creature. We just find ourselves in all these different situations historically, and watching how the human animal behaves historically can tell you a lot about what to expect in the present and in the future. So when I look at the world out there today from a historical perspective, I realize that I have not found any exceptions to the rule that if you want peace, prepare for war. I've never found a case where a country was too strong to be attacked. Ever. I find countless examples of wars starting and invasions starting because one side assumed that the other side was going to collapse pretty quickly. That was true during the Civil War when the South seceded, before Lincoln was even sworn in, I might add. When the South seceded, they knew that there was a possibility of war with the North, and they were quite sure that they could whip those Yankees because the philosophers of the South, the culture of the South, they called themselves the chivalry. That was the term they applied to themselves. That planter culture. They were convinced that every Southern gentleman's worth 10 Yankees, and if we ever got into a fight, they'd whip us out of our boots. And frankly, they did for the first half of the war until big northern boiler got up to speed, and then the South was utterly destroyed as a culture. Gone. The Japanese thought that they could sink our fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the result would be that we would simply withdraw and say, okay, well, we'll just stay here in America then. They thought that there might have been a battle for Hawaii. They thought it unlikely. They did attack us, And so you have to ask yourself, when they attacked us, what were they thinking? Well, it's not a mystery what they were thinking. When the Japanese attacked America in 1941, they were thinking that by sinking our fleet, that we would cede them not the entire Pacific, but the Western Pacific, because that's all they were interested in. All of the Japanese supply lines, Japan has nothing on its own. All the Japanese supply lines went down to the New Guinea and through the various island chains. Their calculation was, if we destroy the American fleet, they will basically give up half of the Pacific, and we will own this quarter of the world from Hawaii to the west, all of the countries of Southeast Asia, and what they called the Greater Asian Prosperity Sphere, and they basically thought that was what's going to happen, but that's not what happened. What happened was that their entire culture was destroyed. Germany believed it had plenty of evidence to think it could take Europe. It took France. People look at World War II. I'm making a case here. People look at World War II and the fall of France. France fought for 6 weeks before it collapsed. But during the entire fight, the French had a larger army than the Germans. They had more tanks than the Germans. They had more airplanes than the Germans. They just plain collapsed because of the trauma of World War I. They just didn't want to go through with it again. So they folded their deck. Hitler was convinced that he could defeat the British. And when he couldn't defeat them in the air, Hitler was never water scared Hitler like it scares vampires. He didn't want to cross the English Channel, especially with the Royal Navy. So he said, let's go knock Russia out of the war, and then we'll finish up Britain. And so that's what he did. And he thought he could knock Russia out of the war because he saw how Russia fought in World War I. But he was wrong. And so his culture, fortunately, was utterly destroyed. The Soviets invaded Western Europe, rightfully so, during the war, on their way to Berlin. And when the fall of Germany happened, wherever those armies were, that's where the dividing line came. So what happened in the years after World War II? We were allies with the Soviet Union during World War II. We made a number of agreements with the Soviets during World War II. We made them in Yalta mostly, but mostly we made them in Potsdam, the Potsdam Conference. And at Potsdam, Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, it wasn't even Churchill, it was whoever replaced him, I've forgotten his name, doesn't deserve to be remembered. And Stalin basically said, here's how we're going to handle things. We had agreements with the Soviets, and within a few weeks at the end of World War II, the Russians started going back on their promises that were made as allies. There were promises for free elections in Poland, and Russia said, no, our army sits in Poland, we're going to determine who governs Poland. It's going to be somebody who we put there. And Berlin was considered to be a free city, and they said, well, we're going to own half of Berlin, and, well, the West has access to the other half of Berlin. They closed it off against the treaty, and so we did the Berlin airlift. They realized that they couldn't beat us in that front. And so if you look at the history since World War II, it's nothing but Russian aggression. Nothing but Russian aggression, period. That's all it is. Russian aggression. They broke their promises. They refused to withdraw their armies. We withdrew ours. They strengthened their armies. They openly tried to overthrow governments around the world. They launched invasions not only into Korea and Vietnam, the communists, the philosophy. And by the way, let's just be crystal clear on this. There is no Korean War unless the North Koreans are sure that the Russians are going to back them with equipment and, at the very least, equipment and advice. Same thing for Vietnam. There's no fighting the Korean War or the Vietnamese War unless the Soviets are actively behind one side of the equation. So when we fought both those wars, the jets we were fighting in the skies over Korea and Vietnam were Soviet jets. And if it had been just North Korea or just North Vietnam, those wars would have been over in 2 weeks. Those wars were started by the communists. The invasion of Hungary was started by the communists. The invasion of Czechoslovakia was started by the communists. And the invasion, the uprisings that are attempted in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, brutally put down by the communists. And they continued to expand. They continued to keep pushing the borders. So it became clear certainly within a few years after the war, that these people who we had just been fighting with not only are not trustworthy, they are openly saying that they are going to take over the world. And they were proving it. These aggressions actually happened. These countries, Czechoslovakia at the time, Poland, East Germany, these people are enslaved. The best thing I ever heard about communism is that communism is such an awful system of government that it made poor people out of Germans. And none of this was started by the West. None of this was instigated by the United States or its allies. But in the face of this ongoing constant aggression and refusal to agree to the rules that they'd already signed on paper in treaties, the Western nations of Europe said, well, we better do something about this, so they formed NATO. It's not like the Russians ended World War II, did what we did, which is demilitarize, take their tanks home, and next thing you know, they find this aggressive NATO on their border invading their countries. That's not what happened. It was just the opposite. NATO is a defensive alliance against Soviet and Russian aggression. And that alliance has been the most successful alliance in history. And I'm married to a Russian. Unlike most of the people who are making comments about Russia and Ukraine and all the rest of this stuff, I'm married to one. And also, unlike many of them, I know a great deal about the history of their governments and their society. Russians are aggressive because they're paranoid, and they have a right to be paranoid. That country has been invaded from all sides through its entire history. Last time it was invaded, 20 million people were killed. I think 20 million civilians plus 20 million in the army. 20 million people at a time when the population of New York was, 4 or 5 million? So when you lose 20 million people or more to German tanks, it's not something you forget very soon. It's not something they forgot after Napoleon invaded and burned Moscow to the ground either, or when Sweden was invading them, or when the invasions came from the Mongols, or when the invasions came from the fighting with the Japanese on the eastern side of the country. It's an enormous country. It's 1/6 of the world's land surface area. They are at war constantly. They're being invaded constantly. And the Russian mindset is, in order for us to be secure, we have to have buffer zones. And those buffer zones have to be consisting of territory that we don't consider Russian, so that the next time we're invaded, the invaders will have to go through somebody else's country before they come to our country, and that'll give us time to react. And that is the Russian outlook, has been the Russian outlook forever, was the Russian outlook crystal clear at the end of the war, and that all of the Eastern European countries under direct communist control, military control, coercion, they didn't want to be there, didn't vote to be there. But the countries that eventually made up the Warsaw Pact as an alliance, it's a joke. The Warsaw Pact wasn't an alliance. Moscow controlled all of these governments. It wasn't an alliance. NATO was an alliance. If Britain wanted to do something that America didn't want, America had no coercive power over Britain to make them do it. But on the Eastern Bloc, everything came from Moscow. Everything. And they simply wouldn't stop. And they never stopped. They never, ever stopped. So, having spoken to my wife about this at length, who is Russian and who is acutely embarrassed, and embarrassed is not strong enough a word, distressed over what Putin did in 2021, 22. I honestly can't remember what was the pandemic, the invasion. I think it was 22. But she will still tell me the Russian position on this. And she says that the Russian position on this is, how would you feel if Arizona or California, let's say, left the Union and then Soviets put bases all throughout California? How would you like that? And I said, well, I wouldn't like that at all. But here's the problem. The problem is that Ukraine and Poland and Belarus, Uzbekistan, all of them, are not states. They are other countries. This is the moral and political argument. They are sovereign entities. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the coercive control over those governments no longer was possible. So they started to go their own way. And Russia didn't like this at all, because it left them without their psychological need for buffers. Americans have a psychological need for buffers too. We don't actually need it. In fact, we're not only not paranoid, we're way too naive most of the time, because we don't have buffer states. We have buffer oceans. We have thousands of miles of moats between us and our enemies in terms of, at least in terms of conventional warfare. We have the longest, most successful peaceful border in the history of the world with Canada, and we have a largely peaceful border with Mexico, although we're beginning, obviously, for several years now, decades now, beginning to see that this is porous in a way but it's not a battlefront. It probably should be, but it certainly wasn't for most of our history. So, Russia, when the Soviet Union fell, there was a period of about 10 years when Russia behaved itself. And I'm not speaking as a classroom teacher who's lecturing these peasants on how to behave. I'm not saying America decided that they behaved themselves. When I say they behaved themselves, what I mean is they tried to integrate into Western society. They stopped their aggression because they couldn't afford it anymore. And the tragedy of our age is what happened during the 1990s. That's the tragedy. We took the so-called peace dividend and said it was the end of history. We don't have to worry about it anymore. My wife tells me what it felt like to be. My wife grew up was born in the Soviet Union and grew up in the Soviet Union. She was a teenager when the Soviet Union fell, and in the years after that, she says this went right through me like a hot knife through butter. So if you're an American patriot, you might want to pay attention to this. She said that every Russian can remember Boris Yeltsin going to one of these G7 summits or something like this and being asked to wait in the lobby. That Russia's economy is not in the top 10 in the world. That the West humiliated Russia. I don't know if we did it intentionally. I personally don't feel like I felt the need to. But the Russian people felt that humiliation very strongly, and we would feel it too. That's what they said. They said that basically at these economic conferences, in an attempt to bring Russia into the family of nations, we could have helped them in, but we basically told them to hold our coats and get our coffee. That was a big mistake. And after 10 years of those humiliations, the Russian people found a guy who promised to restore them to their former glory, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler did. And I'm not making that comparison lightly. I don't automatically compare people to Hitler if I don't like them. But he went down the same road. So we're a great nation, a great people. We are a superpower, and I will rebuild Russia, and I will return us to the glory of the Soviet Union. That was Putin's entire argument, and that's pretty much what he did. Because Yeltsin was a drunkard, and Yeltsin had his moment at the fall of the Soviet Union. But Yeltsin was by no means a great statesman, to say the very least. But we were not. We could have welcomed them into the Society of Nations. We could have helped Russia the way that we helped Germany and Japan after we defeated them in World War II, because we defeated the Soviets in the Cold War. There's no question about that. When Mikhail Gorbachev, the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, is in a Pizza Hut commercial, that's a win for the capitalists. That is not Ronald Reagan dying in a gulag someplace. That's a win for the communists. So we won the Cold War, and we could have helped them up like we did with the Germans and the Japanese, could have turned them into our strongest allies. We didn't do it. We just didn't do it. And that was a gigantic mistake, and we should have known better. But nevertheless, that's what happened. And so here we are. Vladimir Putin lied about his age to work for the KGB. The KGB is the direct descendant of the MKVD, the OGPU, all the way back to the Cheka. It is an organization that has murdered 20 million Russians in order to maintain the control of the central communist government. 20 million of their own people they killed. Not during World War II. Executed, sent to the gulags. 20 million of their own people starved to death in Ukraine, when Ukraine was a Soviet Socialist Republic. That's what he wanted to be a part of. And he eventually became the director of the KGB. The most remarkable thing I ever heard and learned about this, I mentioned it in detail in An Empire of Terror. You really need to sit and listen to this, because this is really important. When you have a dictatorship or an autocracy, the country is no longer doing the will of the people. America stumbles from one place to another based on who we elect. And one of the big problems with that is we'll often walk over to one side and make some promises and then immediately come back and break them. But in an autocracy or a dictatorship, which is what Russia is, the motivations of the country are reduced to the motivations of the individual. He decides. If you didn't know this, you should prepare yourself for this. The Soviet Union, the communist state, was founded by Vladimir Lenin through coercion. Lenin was notoriously unhuman. He had no friends, very, very closed, complete intellectual, just a robot. He moved to a small mansion, a large dacha, where he spent his final years. And typically, for the paranoid, violent-minded Vladimir Lenin, his household consisted of his wife, two of his sisters, 4 bodyguards on patrol outside, a secretary, and a cook. And after Lenin died, the cook was hired by Stalin, who was also notoriously secretive and private. And so the cook went from being Lenin's personal live-in servant to being Stalin's personal live-in servant, and did so for the entire duration of Stalin's rule over the Soviet Union. So this cook saw the birth of the Communist Revolution, lived with Ilyich Lenin, the savior of the working man, lived in his house, saw him every day, then lived in Stalin's house, saw him every day, while Soviet Union went from being an agrarian backwards country to being a world superpower that put the first man in space and had nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines and all the rest of it. And that cook's name was Spiridon Putin. And Spiridon Putin was Vladimir Putin's grandfather. Spiridon Putin died when Vladimir Putin was 16. So that gave him 16 years of having little Vladimir on his knee, and not just telling him about the glories of the Soviet Union, but telling him about the Soviet Union from the only ringside seat that there was. Not one of the ringside seats, the only ringside seat. He's the only individual in the history of the Soviet Union. There was only one person who lived with, on a daily basis, Vladimir Lenin and Stalin throughout Stalin's entire reign, and that was Vladimir Putin's grandfather. So if you think that Vladimir Putin's view of the Soviet Union as an aggressive power and bad guys, no. Spiridon Putin convinced his grandson, and his son too, obviously, that this communist regime was the best government that could ever be devised, and that they had a moral obligation to spread it all over the world. And if you ended up killing half the population to make the other half communist, well, then that's just a price you have to pay. That was inculcated in that boy from the time he first drew breath. If you don't understand that Vladimir Putin's grandfather was Lenin's personal cook and Stalin's personal cook, then you'll never understand Vladimir Putin. He is determined to restore Russia to the Soviet Union. And in order to do that, he has to first acquire the one thing that Russia needs more than anything, which is buffer states. Unfortunately for Vladimir Putin and world peace, the people in Ukraine, in Poland, Belarus, the Latvian countries, all of the nations that surround Russia, unfortunately for Vladimir Putin, those people feel like they have their own identity. They tend to think of them, people from Latvia tend to think of themselves as Latvians, and if Russia thinks of Latvia as a buffer state, then too bad for the Latvians. It doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work like that. Bart's Treasure says it's a monologue instead of a discussion. I've been going a long time. You're right, but I have to make the case, so that's that. So what used to be a Russian birthright, which is how my wife views the Ukraine, my wife feels that, I said the Ukraine, my wife feels that Ukraine was built up by Russian money and Russian technology, that Russia, as the leader of the Soviet Union, poured enormous resources into the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic. And then when the Soviet Union fell, the Ukrainians, out of spite, basically took all the fish that they'd been given and said, see you later, took the resources and just left and went their own way, and then allied with their ancient enemies in the West. And I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But so the question really is, take Ukraine out of it. Feelings are very, very high on that front. Let's talk about a country that's not in the fight right now. Does Russia have a right to invade and occupy Poland in order to satisfy its somewhat justified paranoia of invasion, yes or no? That's the question, really. That's the question. I think you can make that as a very fair question to ask. Ukraine, whether you like Ukraine or not, it doesn't matter. Whether you approve of the invasion or not, doesn't matter. There's no question that Ukraine was a sovereign nation. So take Ukraine out of the picture, look at Poland, which is also a sovereign nation, and ask yourself, does Russia have the right to invade Poland in order to feel good about its own security. Does it have the right to send tanks into Poland, to send rocket attacks into Warsaw? Does it have the right to do that? And if they say, well, Poland used to belong to the Soviet Union, the Polish response would be, yeah, but we didn't want to be. You kept us here with tanks. So if the answer is no, which seems clear to me, that the answer would be no, Russia does not have the right to invade another country just because it feels insecure about being invaded, then you can't deny the Ukrainians the same level of sovereignty and respect you would give to the Poles. Do the Poles have the right to defend themselves if Russia invaded Poland in order to make it into a Russian puppet state? I say they do. I say they do. And so there you are. So not only do I support Ukraine on this one from a moral perspective, because they are the aggressees, but I also support them from a historical perspective. And the historical perspective is, did you know that in the history of the world that no democracy has ever declared war on another democracy, that has never happened? Ever? Think about that. In the history of the world, there has never been a case where a government that is run by the people of that country have attacked another government that was run by the people of that country. It's never, ever, ever happened before. So, when you have a dictatorship or an autocracy, and the person in charge of that thinks he can get away with something, then they will get away with it. Adolf Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II because France and Britain did nothing when he invaded Czechoslovakia, and they did nothing when he invaded the Sudetenland. They did nothing when he annexed Austria. They did nothing when he put troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. They did nothing. They simply sat there and sent some harshly worded letters and said it's their business. That's what the West said. That's what mostly we're dealing with Britain and France here. Britain and France said it's not our fight, not our problem. It's a German problem. If the Germans want to invade Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, well, that's their business, not our business. Until finally, you had to stop them because it was clear that this dictator was not going to be stopped any other way. And so when I look at the situation in Ukraine, I say either stop him in Ukraine, or if you don't, then you're going to have to stop him in Poland or someplace else. You're going to have to stop him in Finland. Finland used to be a duchy of the Russian Empire. If Russia was a democratic society, it wouldn't be attacking other countries, because that never, ever, ever happens. Ever. Now, from a final point of view, in terms of my support for Ukraine, comes down to world power politics. And by the way, before I get into that, let me say this. We talk about this whole thing like it's theoretical. It's not theoretical. I know people whose homes have been leveled by missile attacks in Kyiv. I know people who go to funerals every single week. I know a person who's a nurse in a hospital in Kyiv who was widowed a year ago because her husband was defending his country. You can say that he didn't have a right to defend his country, and you can say that the invasion was justified, but that's what killed him. He was defending his country. It's not theoretical, but when you step way back and you look at the world today, we have essentially two serious adversaries in the world. We have Russia, because it's got the remnants of a huge military machine and the attitude that comes with it. And we have China, which is a growing power and has designs on a lot of things, because the one thing you can say about China is China doesn't give a damn about anything other than China. And I dare anybody to challenge that idea. Did you not find it interesting? Because I do. One of the criticisms of America, which I think is one of America's greatest compliments, one of the criticisms of America is this. America's got bases all over the world. We have bases, somebody give me the number. I want to say it's 187 countries. and there's only 213 or something. America has bases in something like 187 countries, around 167, something like that, has some form of American military presence. And people look at that and they say, "Oh, see how America is. See how dominating they are. See how much of a hegemon they are. They want to have their military everywhere." But my point is, well, we don't enforce that. We don't coerce people into putting our bases there. If I'm not talking about the total number of bases. Thank you, but I'm talking about the total number of countries. We have alliances with these countries. And the fact that these countries are willing to host American bases, and by the way, right in front of our noses is, for those people who say, well, that's because America's got all its weight throwing its power around and they have no choice. Well, we had two of our biggest installations, I think probably the two biggest installations other than Japan, conceivably Germany, was it Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines and Subic Bay? Enormously expensive naval station and Air Force base that we put millions and millions of dollars into. The reason these countries want these bases, or at least allow them, is because America doesn't take money and resources out of its empire. It pushes resources into its alliances. But when the Filipino people basically said, we don't want you here anymore, we left. Okay. And Subic Bay then became a major Soviet port. It's all pre-built for them. We left. People said Mount Pinatubo had something to do with it, and yes, that was a trigger in a way. A lot of things are triggers, but the ultimate, we wouldn't have abandoned Subic Bay or Clark Air Force Base if we were wanted there, and so here we are. Now, the question I have is, who is China allied with? China has relationships with some unsavory players. China has relationships with North Korea. China has relationships with Iran. China has relationships with Russia. But these are not alliances, and they're certainly not alliances that allow them to station their military in other people's countries. The fact that we have military bases around the world means that we are providing solace for people. I'm certainly willing to go far enough to say, I'm certainly willing to be fair enough to say, it may be for a country a choice between bad and worse, but nevertheless, even if that's the case, everybody knows, would you rather be influenced by the Chinese government or by the American government? Because the American government can't do anything to you. If you don't want us here, we'll leave. So, Steve Young says America has no base in Israel. We have no defense treaty with Israel. We should. So, that's my case for America's position. I think morally, we there's no question that Ukraine is morally in the right and that Russia's in the wrong. Russia is a major threat to our interests and is not our friends. And my view of Ukraine, from a sheer, unemotional, nuts and bolts, get all of the people and all of the tragedy out of it, just look at it as a balance sheet on a spreadsheet. If you just look at it that way, then I say it's in our interest, since they started it, since they were the aggressor, it's in our interest to do to them what they did to us in Vietnam and Korea. Arm indigenous people and make it really hard for America. I have no problems at all with arming Ukraine. Some of the numbers that we're talking about are insane. When we talk about $61 billion to Ukraine, we find out that the United States Marine Corps spends $50 billion a year. I find that to be as appalling as anybody else. It's just insulting. I saw, I forget who it was now, Matt Gaetz perhaps, was talking to the commandant of the United States Marine Corps, and he says, "You've got your budget in for the year, do you? General, whatever." Yes, we do. How would you feel if we doubled it? Would you be able to do anything? This is testimony just a couple days ago, and the commandant of the Marine Corps said, "I'm sorry." And Gates said, "No. What if we doubled your budget? You want $50 billion a year? That's what we give you. What if we gave you $100 billion? Are there things you could do with it?" And the guy just went, "Well, Yeah, yeah. Yes. And then Gates said, well, we spend 50 billion on the Marine Corps, but we spent 61 billion on Ukraine. To that degree and that kind of excess, I'm with you 100%. But giving people weapons to defend their country against aggression, when those people they're defending against are our geopolitical arch enemies who will not ever leave us alone. We have never, ever started anything aggressive against Russia. Everything that we've done has been in defense of Russia. And this argument that NATO has encircled Russia and is therefore our fault, we didn't say to other nations, like Poland, for example, or whatever, well, let's just take the ones that just joined. We didn't say to Finland, you join the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance or else we're going to nuke your cities. Each country individually decided to join NATO because they were more afraid of Russia than they were afraid of NATO, and they weren't afraid of NATO at all for good reason. So there you go. That's how I look at the world. And I happen to believe, and this is the thing I wanted to close on, and I'm sorry that he left because I don't blame him for having listened to me for go on for an hour about this, but I have to make my case here because I am going to be the nexus of all this. My final argument is this. I think there's a practical reason for the support of Ukraine. I think it's in our national interest to support them with weapons. You have never heard me say, and you never will hear me say, that we should have American troops over there, American lives on the line. You've never heard me say that because I utterly 100% opposed to that, 100%. And if you say, well, that's not possible, I would reply by saying Soviets did it for 11 years in Vietnam, and they did it for 4 or 5 years in Korea. But the ultimate question is, I don't just see America as a military balance sheet. I'm a little naive and idealistic when it comes to this kind of thing. Idealism can get you into a lot of trouble, and there's no question about that. But I still believe that America is a force of good in the world, and I do believe it is the defender of freedom in the world. And we talk about that, and we're proud of it. But we basically have to either live up to it or stop bragging about it. Now, I see in the comment sections from Dragonhold 4 that said NATO should have dissolved with the Soviet Union. And my response to you, if you've been listening, Dragons, and again, I'm trying to keep this as civil as I can. If the Soviet Union, if Russia had lived up to its obligations and not been so aggressive, then NATO would have withered on the vine. But it was only 2008 when Russia first invaded Georgia, once it was sure that Barack Obama was going to win. In the end of the 2008 election cycle, when it was clear Barack Obama was going to win, Putin decided that he could send troops into Georgia and take over Georgia. That's exactly what he did. And a couple years later, he did the same thing into Ukraine because he knew he could get away with it. And the only time, by the way, that Russia was not being aggressive somewhere around the world was the 4-year period when Donald Trump was president, because Donald Trump said to him, if you do this, then I'm going to strike Moscow. And now, the dictator who hears nothing but good news, who hears nothing but how strong and how powerful they are from his own generals, now he's got to figure in the calculations. Well, now there's a lunatic running the United States government. And I'm virtually positive he wouldn't actually do it, but I can't be sure. So it's not worth it. It's not worth it. This is why nuclear weapons have kept the peace. There is no longer and why I don't fear nuclear war. Because we've had so many opportunities to push that button, so many provocations to push that button. In the heat of an ongoing active war where both sides are on 24/7 aerial alert, so many opportunities to push that button, and we didn't do it because you cannot escape the consequences of nuclear weapons, and that is if you launch civilization-level aggression in the age of nuclear weapons, you will destroy your country in the process, and there is no conceivable gain that is worth the destruction of your homeland. That's a history changer. And there's no way around that equation. So that's my case. That's why I believe what I believe. And I'm sorry it took longer than I wanted it to, but it's a complicated argument. So now I am more than happy to deal with the comment sections and see what people have to say about this, and happy to argue or discuss these things. Not argue, discuss them, and see what we could do to come to some kind of agreement or understanding or something. I'll take all of these as good faith. Let's go, Brandon. All other things being equal, the defense of Ukraine is not worth the risk of human extinction, which I think we are risking by taking pokes at Russia like we are. The only reasonable way to deal with this is an overwhelming world response and give Putin no alternative but to stop. I'm going to take these one at a time. First of all, let's take the first half of it. Let me take the second half of that first. The only reasonable way to deal with this is to have an overwhelming world response and give Putin no alternative but to stop. I would say that there has been an overwhelming world response. We are not the largest supplier of weapons to Ukraine. I don't even think we're in the top 3. There has been an overwhelming international response to Putin, and he keeps fighting. So to say that that's the solution doesn't seem to make sense to me personally, Lesko, because it was the first thing that happened. The first part of it's a little more interesting. All the other things being equal, the defense of Ukraine is not worth the risk of human extinction, which I think we are risking by taking pokes at Russia like we are. How are we poking Russia? I'm looking at the board and I'm saying it's Russia that did the poking. If Ukraine had invaded Russia, that would be one story. If NATO had built an Air Force base on the border, that would have been provoking Russia. But it's not what happened. People say, well, there are CIA operatives in Ukraine. Well, of course there are. And there are KGB operatives in San Francisco as well. But that's not the same thing. And we both know it. So I don't know if I look, I'd like to believe it was different. And by the way, this is the thing. See, this is what dictators count on. Dictators and autocrats and aggressors count on you being more afraid of them than they are of you. This is the entire calculation right there. This is the Pinto and the Mercedes argument. The idea that if you have got a Mercedes and a Pinto, beat up old Pinto and a brand new Mercedes merging into the same lane, the Mercedes is going to back out first because they got more to lose. There's something to that argument. But what you're saying is what causes war. We can't possibly oppose them because if we do, it's going to lead to war. That's how we got into World War II. That's exactly precisely verbatim what the governments of France and Britain said. They'd gotten very weak in the interim, and they said, we can't stop Hitler. If we stop Hitler, we'll have to fight, and if we fight, then we're going to be in a world war, and we can't risk that, which is what allowed the World War to happen. We know for a certain fact from the German High Command records is one thing about defeating an enemy thoroughly. And that is after the Second World War was over, we had a chance to look at the records of OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. And the generals in the German High Command had a number of memos, and they basically said if Hitler had been opposed when he marched a few units into the demilitarized Rhineland, if there'd been a single French policeman on a bridge who refused to move, they would have backed up, turned around, Hitler would have been deposed, and that would have been the end of the Soviets, period. So this idea that we can't possibly fight them or act like we're ready to fight them, if we do, that's going to lead to war, sounds logical because that's how rational people behave, but the history shows us that it's just not true. History shows us, in fact, recent history shows us, that you don't stop Russian aggression by saying, well, let's be reasonable about this. You stop it by being completely unreasonable. If you attack Ukraine, I'm gonna hit Moscow. You make it too expensive to consider, and that is what works. Do you have a source for that? I don't remember what the source is, but I did see it. As I saw it firsthand, so I have a high level of confidence about that. So back to Lesko again. One, no doubt Russia was the first mover in the aggressor. By taking pokes, I'm referencing taking jabs, arms, cash, propping up Ukraine versus an overwhelming response. By an overwhelming response, I'm talking about moving troops and fleets, showing them he will have to fight the world. Oh, I see. So you're saying we underreacted to that. There's an argument to be made for that. There's an argument to be made for that. I don't know what the answer to that would have been. Here's what I do know. 100% certain, 100% certain that Vladimir Putin believed his own propaganda, and he thought that this would be a 2-week operation, that Ukraine would cave, that there was no Ukrainian nationalism, that the Ukrainian people wanted the Russians to come in and liberate them. This is what he's been told. That's what he believes. That's what he grew up with. I have no doubt he believed it. None. Because there's no other way to justify this. Now, we are in the situation where it's now a face issue. And America's not immune to this either. You know, a lot of the Vietnam War, especially under Johnson, was fought because, well, we don't think we can win, but we certainly don't want to lose. We don't want to be seen in defeat, so we'll just keep kind of going about this the way that we've been going about it forever, which is fighting it horribly badly. Finally, Nixon comes in and took him a whole first term, but finally got to the point in 1972 when Nixon says, I'm tired of all this. Let's just end this. Why don't we just end this war? He didn't end the war by pulling out. He ended the war by bombing North Vietnam. North Vietnam had decided to not come to peace agreements and stalled because it wasn't in their interest to sign peace agreements. They were gradually eating up the South. And finally, in 1972, Richard Nixon decides to use the might of the United States of America at some actual fraction of its value, starts sending B-52 raids over Hanoi. Now the North Vietnamese are paying the price, and they are feeling the pain personally. The leaders, I mean. The people had been suffering for 30 years. But the second that happened, they were at the table. And a short time after that, they signed a peace agreement. They went back behind the line. War was over. We won. That's telling me something. And it's not the only time that happened. Copy should not have a pro-American system and pro-American people, absolutely, but trust federal government as it is now, trust the military as it is now. I don't trust the federal government. I am deeply concerned about the inroads into the military, but ultimately, the government is made of bureaucrats. The military is made of individuals, and while that situation's gotten very alarming, I still have a great deal of confidence in the character of the United States military. Although I'm with you on that one. So I'm trying to be fair here. A couple of nice comments from here. Thomas Amundsen saying that the What We Saw series has so much more depth than what he learned in school. Thank you. I'm trying to do that. Brooke Davis says, why are we half-assing it in Ukraine? Why not go the whole hog? I don't. Well, I'm not trying to think of excuses. I'm trying to just work through the problem. Ukraine was not a U.S. ally in the way that South Korea is. Why has there not been another war in the Korean Peninsula since the end of 1953? Well, one of the reasons is, and by the way, in Korea, let's take this as an example to answer that question. Why not go the whole hog? In the Korean Peninsula, the North Koreans have constantly been attacking the South. They sink their patrol ships, they have infiltrators, they launch rockets, they do all kinds of things. But the reason that the North hasn't tried it again is not just because the South Korean army is much stronger than it was in the First Korean War. The reason that the North Koreans do not attack South Korea is because we have several thousand, tens of thousands of Americans stationed there right on the DMZ. This is the tripwire theory, and it's a good theory. I believe that this theory has genuine, provable merit. The idea being that if North Korea were to attack South Korea, the first thing that would happen is they would kill a significant number of Americans who would be defending that border with our ally, South Korea. So it was clear in a situation like that, this is true for NATO as well. It's crystal clear for NATO, whatever the clause is. It's right there. I forget the second clause or the sixth. I forget what the clause is. But basically, it's in the charter, and it's the reason that the charter's there. It's in fact the only reason you need this to make the charter much simpler. If any single one of us is attacked, we will consider it as an attack on all of us. That's a tripwire. That's clear. Ukraine was not in that position. And to be fair to Russia, to the degree that you can be fair to Russia, You can't, I don't think you can, it's not a question of morally or anything, it's just from a common sense perspective. Russia's not going to have a rational reaction to a response equivalent to an attack on NATO as it does with an attack on Georgia or Ukraine or Belarus. See what I'm saying? He knows that if he had attacked a NATO country, then he's going to get the tripwire. And then you go at it with fleets. But he didn't do that. And this is why people are joining the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. That's why it's not getting smaller, it's getting bigger. If you think about it, Finland and was it Norway? I don't remember. I think Norway's been part of NATO. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know which two. I know Finland's one of them. Might be Denmark. They've stayed out of NATO for 80 years. They border the Soviet Union. They've stayed out of it for 80 years. But this made them say, nope, nope. Sweden? Finland and Sweden. Okay. Think about that. They've managed to be neutral for 80 years. Officially neutral. Ukraine was not a member of NATO. If it had been, he wouldn't have attacked it. And that's why you have NATO. Look, I'll tell you what I want for Russia. I want Russia, and the same thing goes for China. I just want them to stop being dicks, you know? I want them to get over it. We have had the history of the Cold War, plus the years since then, which is photographic evidence that we have no designs on their territory, and why would we? We've got the best country in the world. I don't mean just politically the best country in the world. I mean we have the best territory in the world, America. It's without question, it's the best single patch of land on the planet. When Americans say we have no territorial designs on you, people that have been invaded their entire history don't believe us. But we don't. And why would we? And as I said at the beginning of this narration, at the end of World War II, we could have essentially ruled the world through coercive force if we wanted to, and then all the insurrections would have started. I'm not saying anything like that. But we didn't. We came home. So there you go. Let me see what else we got here. Article 5, thank you. That's why I believe what I believe. Let's go again. Bottom line to my point is that I think it's far more dangerous to take half measures than to walk up to his border, draw a line, and dare him to cross it as Trump did. Yes, I agree with you, and it worked when Trump did it, but you can't. But to do it after the Afghanistan debacle is to try to lock the barn after the horses escaped. I don't believe he would have gone into Ukraine if it hadn't been for how we handled Afghanistan. Or at the very least, I am convinced that Afghanistan made it much easier for him to come to the conclusion that he wanted to come to. Marisha Dark says, I treat our role like parenting. We should be a role model and teach others independence by example. Too much intervention becomes a helicopter parenting. Too little becomes negligence. I think that's a lovely way to put it. And while I've been defending America and Americans' positions the entire time, America's position in terms of our consistency with our allies has been just astonishingly shameful, dishonorable and shameful. And the way that we abandoned the South Vietnamese, the way that we abandoned our on-the-ground allies in Afghanistan, our on-the-ground allies in Iraq, it is shameful. It is shameful to me. If I was a government of another country, I wouldn't trust America. I'd want to, but I wouldn't. Because, well, I'm sorry to say it, but because Democrats. You can argue all you want to, but that's what happened. We pushed the North Vietnamese back behind the line. The war was over. We won. And the next year, Democrats swept to power because of Watergate, and they lost the peace. We had gotten to the point in Iraq with the surge where we had not had a single American casualty for 4 or 5 months prior to to Barack Obama becoming president of the United States. Not a single American casualty in 4 or 5 months. Things were starting to stabilize. And then Barack Obama couldn't form a simple status of forces agreement, just a simple treaty that basically says, we're just going to kind of continue here the way we're going on. And so we pulled out of there, and that place went to hell. And then same thing with Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a unique case. For a while, it looked like Karzai and all the rest of it could form an actual government there. There had been a government prior to Islam being there, but it's ungovernable. Afghanistan is just a place we need to go and mow the lawn. We just need to go and mow the lawn once every couple of months. And there's that. So I hope I've made my position. I'm not asking you to agree with me, but I hope at least you understand why I feel the way I feel. Because I have reasons for this, and I think they're good reasons. Darth Chuck the Merciless points out 2 Swedish fighters escorted one engine-out SR-71 out of danger in the 1980s to keep it from being shot down in international airspace by the Russians. Yes, the Swedes are allies. Look, the reason we have all these bases around the world, guys, is because pretty much everybody is our ally, except for China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Pakistan, probably. Our strongest alliance building right now should be with India. We need to be, we would really, from a geopolitical point of view, I'd be asking India out on a date. I just think that to me is our clearest our strongest potential ally in the future. Obviously, Canada. If I was president of the United States, I would do a world tour. I would depart from Ottawa, because I'd visit Canada first. That just needs to be stressed. They make a big deal about which country does the new president visit first. For me, I visit Canada first. That is the rear. That border. It's not in any danger, but that's the first thing I'd do. Second place I'd go would be Australia. Then I'd go to India, and then I'd go to Great Britain, around the world on the way back. That's what I would do on my first trip. This is something Eric says, and Trump got close to getting North Korea to pacify. This is why Donald Trump is a genius. A genius. And why he's such a great president. Because ultimately, the chief executive of the country is the guy that does the deals internationally. That's his actual power. And when Donald Trump went to North Korea with computer renderings of what North Korea could have been if it decided to join the family of nations, that reports are that actually had him convinced. Then along comes Sleepy Joe, and that appeal of missiles and all the rest of that stuff starts sounding better and better. People are starving to death, and this little fat idiot is born into his tyranny, and the people have been so brutalized that I believe that North Koreans genuinely believe that they are the greatest country in the world. I have no doubt of it. Eric says he also brought Dennis Rodman with him because Kim Jong-un loves basketball. I would have brought LeBron James. I would have brought the Lakers. I would have brought the NBA. I'm serious. I would have brought the entire NBA. Said, Kim, I'd like you to meet the NBA. Here they are. Here's 747s to the horizon. Ask them all the questions you want to. If you decide to come in from the rain, you could have your own NBA team. Think about that. You could play basketball in the Olympics. You could hire guys. They'll work for whoever pays the most money, The Japanese found that out with baseball players. Think about it. Battle Smurf says, where's President Trump's Peace Prize for working with North Korea? It's in the same place that his Nobel Peace Prize is for having brokered a peace agreement in the Middle freaking East. He had agreement, the Abrahamic Accords, he had an agreement with every single actual country in the Middle East with a peace agreement with Israel. And the only people that were left out were the Palestinians. And he had a peace agreement where finally Jordan or Egypt or whatever would step in and do what they have to solve this thing. Marusha Dark says, what about Putin's successor? I'm not saying Putin's successor is going to be a Jeffersonian Democrat. What I am saying is that Putin's successor, look, Putin has achieved what all dictators must achieve, and what the Soviet Union did for its entire existence. It's true in Iraq. It's true in China. She is trying to do it, but he's not nearly as effective at it as Vladimir, because Vladimir's basically got the receipts. They are delivering the vision of themselves that they want to see. That Putin has a cult of personality. People support Putin because they've supported him since 2000, and they've watched their country grow stronger. At least they thought they have, and they're no longer this hat in hand, lick spittle, beggar state. Putin has buffed up his military and cleaned up Moscow, and Moscow's a beautiful city now, a much nicer place than any certainly than the place I live in Los Angeles. So it's a cult of personality. So when Putin goes, there's going to be an autocrat replacing him. But whoever that autocrat is, the fact that we can't name him means that there's nobody who's going to have his power. You see what I'm saying? There's no Putin Jr. waiting in the wings. Whoever succeeds him is not going to have anything like his autocratic power, because he doesn't have a reputation. In fact, the largest potential candidates for Putin's replacement have been killed by Putin as a special side benefit of the Ukraine war. The head of the Wagner group. Oops. Various generals and marshals. Oops. Defense ministers. Oops. A lot of people accidentally falling downstairs in Russia these days. And I do believe that look, I think America's position should be this: whenever there's any kind of an internal conflict in a country, a rebellion or something that looks like it might turn into civil war or something like that, I think our position is to sit down, take an honest appraisal, and figure out who's on the side of the most freedom. And we morally support that faction. Morally. We don't start selling weapons to every faction around the world. That's just nuts. Okay? Nuts. But when Iranian people are trying to rise up against the Ayatollah and the Islamic totalitarian regime, Barack Obama could have put the prestige of the United States behind him. Just the prestige, not the weapons, not the boots, nothing, just the prestige, and said, we are with these people because they're fighting for freedom, and we represent freedom in the world. We are a living example of what freedom can do for everybody on this planet. And so we support the people that are striving for freedom in Iran. You can talk to the people in the countries of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, and they will tell you with tears in their eyes what it meant to hear the President of the United States describe the Soviet Union as an evil empire. That gave them courage. It made them believe that they had a chance to overthrow those regimes. We didn't overthrow those regimes. We bankrupted the Soviet Union. We contained the Soviet Union. We didn't liberate those countries. They liberated themselves. Thank you, Book. Very nice of you. Very kind. But Eastern Europe was under the boot until three people came along And these three people, which I mentioned in my Cold War series, these three liberators, gave the inhabitants of Eastern Bloc countries the courage to believe that they were not only on the side of right, but that there were forces in the world bigger than they were that were on their side. And those three people were Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher. Those three people ended the Cold War. Morally, they said this is an evil empire and it deserves to fall. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So they did. Ray has listed this many times, and I keep glancing at it, and I didn't mean to keep going over it. But he says the United States isn't the world's policeman, but we're the world's SWAT team: Korea, Desert Storm, Bosnia, K4, etc. Yes, and knowing that there's a SWAT team out there is a deterrent to people who want to make a living with a life of crime, especially a life of violent crime. This is the thing about a powerful force, you see, and this is why I'm such a hawk. People think I'm a hawk because I like war. No, on the contrary, I understand more about war than most people who are having this discussion. I don't claim to have lived through it because that would be incredibly arrogant of me, but as a person on the sidelines, I would say I have a better view than most. And I'm a hawk, not because I love war, I'm a hawk because I love peace. I'm a hawk because I am utterly convinced, morally, politically, economically, and militarily, that no one has ever been so strong that they got invaded. Ever. And I'm ashamed when America doesn't stand up for freedom. So my administration, if I was president, I'd have probably a 2 or 3 tiered system. First tier would be countries that we have no relationship with whatsoever, like Iran. If there's a pro-freedom movement, then we give them the moral support and the rhetorical support, and let them know they're not alone. Then we have another tier for independent nations that are under aggression from either China or Russia, and depending on the circumstances, on whether or not they are willing to fight for their own country. You got to give that to the Ukrainians. We wouldn't be having this discussion about the amount of money sending support and arms to Ukraine if the Ukrainians weren't prepared to fight for their own country. We've not lost a single American serviceman in Ukraine, and I'd like to keep it that way. But hundreds of thousands of them have died, and I have the feeling that if I lived in Ukraine, I would be one of them. If I lived in Ukraine, I would try to send my wife out of harm's way, but I couldn't go with her, which she would not like, but she would understand because she knows who I am and how I'm built. Let me see. Looks like we got some interesting things over here. Carolina's bless your heart, Bill, but you don't have a clue. I said we're going to keep this civil, and I'm happy to do that. That's not an obnoxious expression. So calmly and with the deepest respect, and for the sake of the conversation, tell me what I got wrong. Because if somebody can convince me that I'm wrong, I'll change my mind. We haven't lost anyone in Ukraine that we know of. Okay, well, there's not much I can do about that. Here's a first-time chat from Texas Jojo 24. I read Jeff Gwynn's books on Manson and Jones after you mentioned them last year. I was born in 1967 and missed the 60s, so I had no idea of the hatred of America by a loud portion of Americans at the time. The 70s seemed quite harmonious to me after the turbulent time of the 60s. Are we looking at a repeat back to the feelings of the 70s after this current turbulence? I don't know. That's an interesting question. I was born in 59, so my childhood was in the 60s, but I didn't really become a human, fully formed, human till the 70s. And I graduated high school in 1977, and we were sitting around with my friends. We were all a bunch of movie makers, and I had a friend named Lee Kolosna, who was much more aware of things than we were. And we were just sitting outside, driving around in Charlie Allen's converted van with an incredible carpeting on the sides of the walls and incredible sound speaker, driving around Coral Gables. And Lee said, you realize that we have grown up in the most boring period in American history, right? What? No, everything, our entire existence is the most boring period in American history. John Eden with a 99.99 super chat, and I missed one earlier. I'm going to scroll back up and see if I can find it. If I missed the one earlier, I said I will get back to you. I am deeply embarrassed about that. And if you want to send me a 2-cent super chat, I would be delighted to go back and get it. Thank you very much for that, John. It's very kind. Colonel Angus, Bill, you haven't seen the horror and have never had to talk to your friends, orphans, about what happened to their father, which is its own horror. Okay, I agree with you so far, but when you say I haven't seen the horror, it seems to me my entire argument is that this is how you prevent war. If I was saying war is glorious and we all need to sign up and go over there and glide and die gloriously for the flag, then that would be an argument you might want to use against me. So if you could please elaborate, I'm the one who said that this is not just a geopolitical opinion, that people's actual houses are being destroyed, and that I know people who have to deal with this death on a daily basis. That doesn't mean I experience it, but it does mean that I'm aware of it on a personal level. And I see it in people's eyes and I hear it in their voices. So when somebody's 30 years old and they've been to 25 funerals, that's not something I've left out of the equation. So I'm respectfully waiting for a response to that. See if we can come back with something else on it. Checking here. Darth Chuck the Merciless. Cats just want to kill and eat humans. Change my mind. And you want to get involved with another fight we can't win. Okay, so my entire position here has been, from the beginning, crystal clear. That at no point am I calling for U.S. lives in Ukraine. You can say that there's no way that Ukraine can win, and you may be right. But Ukraine can lose, and if Ukraine loses, then Vladimir Putin will have learned that invading another country is ultimately successful. Because I can tell you that somebody who's grown up under the communist system and who wanted to be a part of the KGB is not a person who's particularly concerned about the lives of the Russian people. No one has killed more Russians than Russians. No one. Not even close. If Ukraine falls, Russia gains control of the Black Sea and can make greater headway on forward bases in the Mediterranean and Red Seas, as bad as if China took Taiwan. Mobile Motor says the math dictates that Ukraine will run out of men to fight. Well, they'll run out of men to fight. I'm not entirely sure about that. I mean, obviously the population of Russia is greater than the population of Ukraine. But by and large, there are some exceptions obviously, you've got the entire population engaged in this. An interesting question is, if Donald Trump is reelected, I believe he could stop that conflict pretty quickly. The question is, what would those conditions look like? The thing about Trump is, as I said, you can't imagine a better guy for president because he understands deals. So the art of the deal. So you're going to be a real estate developer in New York, probably the most vicious market that's ever existed, right? The most venal, vicious, mean-spirited, low, dishonorable business dealings ever, which is why I find it so hilarious that he's being, brought on charges for being a New York real estate tycoon. Even the other real estate tycoons who hate his guts come out and say, well, if he's breaking the law, then we're all breaking the law. But let me come back to this. What would that deal look like? Well, here's the thing about that. I'm not a. In fact, I'm a particularly terrible negotiator. I'm not only not a good one. I'm a dreadful one. But what I understand about negotiations is that both sides have things that they want, and both sides have things that they absolutely cannot give up, and that the deal lies in between those two poles. Um, Putin has already lost what he wanted. Putin wanted and expected a painless annexation of Ukraine, not only for the buffer state, but for the shipyards and all the resources and all the rest of it, and to eliminate what he perceived to be a threat. He can perceive NATO to be a threat if he wants. There's nothing I can do about that. The guy's raised on the knee of Spirit and Putin, but you cannot show me one single case in history where NATO was the aggressor, not one. And so it's not my fault if the guy's mentally ill. But if you were Donald Trump, what would you do to end that? Russia will not give up Crimea or Donbass. I'm going to probably regret saying this because there are complications here that this is a known unknown. There are unknowns in what I'm about to say that may make this a very bad idea. But I will tell you what my off the top of my head reaction to this would be. I would let Russia keep the Crimean Peninsula, and I would demand everybody gets out of that. The Russians completely abandon Donbass and all the rest of the regions in Ukraine. And the reason I would do that is, that's what I would do. That's the trade I would make. I would say, Russia has annexed the Ukraine, and the reason I would do that is because Crimea has been Russian for its entire history up until, was it Khrushchev? I think it was Khrushchev who gifted the Crimea to Ukraine. I don't think Ukraine has a historical claim on Crimea. Now, I have heard people say that Ukraine is indefensible unless it owns Crimea. That's a slightly different argument. If it were me, that's what I would propose. Russia, you got Ukraine back because it was in fact Russian. It was actually Russian. It was given to Ukraine as a gesture by Khrushchev. It is enormously, almost exclusively pro-Russian in terms of population. That's codified. In exchange for this, you will take all of your troops out of every single square inch of territory that you invaded in 2022. That's the deal. Crimea would give control of the Black Sea. It's not just cultural, it's strategic. Well, Russia already has control of the Black Sea. There's never been a Ukrainian naval presence in the Black Sea. In fact, one of the most interesting things about the Black Sea is that the Black Sea is a lake. It's a lake that has a single spigot, and the spigot isn't controlled by Russia, and it isn't controlled by Ukraine, and it's not controlled by anybody. It's controlled by Turkey. The Black Sea is, well, I suppose the Mediterranean is very, very similar. Both of them are essentially lakes. The choke point on the Mediterranean is the distance between the Pillars of Atlas, between Gibraltar and the northern tip of Africa. The choke point in the Black Sea are the Dardanelles, where you narrow down to about a mile or less, and there is a treaty that is in place and has been respected certainly since World War II. And that treaty says that there shall not be aircraft carriers allowed into the Black Sea, which is why Russia had to declare the Admiral Kuznetsov, whatever its freaking name is. They had to declare it a cruiser, just definitionally. So You can't have aircraft carriers in the Black Sea, and if you build one in the Black Sea, then the Turks won't let it out of the Black Sea. Turkey is a member of NATO. I think this is an excellent idea. So America can sail destroyers into the Black Sea, but we can't sail carriers into the Black Sea. And if I'm Russia, I'd be in favor of this. If I saw American aircraft carriers in the Black Sea, and I was Russia, that would alarm me as much as seeing a fleet of Chinese aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Mexico. But the Turks, Darth Chuck says Turkey's military is roughly equivalent to a few U.S. states' National Guard and about half of the U.S. mothball fleet. But the point is that Turkey doesn't even have to have a navy. Turkey doesn't even have to have an army. All Turkey has to do is plant a series of explosive charges or chains or whatever you want to say, mines, whatever, and they close off the Black Sea, and it is that narrow and it is that easy to defend. You can bottle up any force that's in the Black Sea on a war footing, on a effortlessly. It's not like trying to block the Straits of Florida. That's 90 miles wide. The Turks can close the Black Sea off from either entering or leaving anytime they want to. So if you gave Ukraine the Crimea, if you gave Russia Crimea back, that'd be a face-saving gesture, and there would be some moral justice involved with it because the Russian people in Crimea had been Russian until Khrushchev just made an off-the-cuff kind of, hey, you know what, take it. Okay? But Donbass and the rest of it, that is territorial Ukraine. You can say, well, there are large numbers of Russians in there, but put that aside. If you give him Donbass in the Ukraine, Donbass and those other regions, then you've rewarded him for his aggression, and that can't happen. You just can't do that. That's what I would do, and I would give him recognition of Crimea as a face-saving measure, and Putin could go to his people and say, all of the Russians who've been suffering under Ukrainian aggression in the Crimean Peninsula have their country back, and then you basically give them a way to back out of the thing. Yeah, the Royal Navy tried to force the Dardanelles in World War I against the Ottoman Empire, and they were forced back. That's very true, Red 4. Although they did not give it their best shot. They used obsolete destroyers, lost a couple of things to mines early, and they just kind of went and walked away. Churchill is famously the author of the Gallipoli campaign to engage Germany in a second front in World War I. And Gallipoli was a disaster, but in fairness to Churchill, Churchill's plan called for the full force of the Royal Navy to support that, and they never got it. Here's some of the unknown unknowns about Crimea you were talking about. So look, we're not neutral in the world. You know, let me rephrase that. I don't believe that America is a morally neutral country, and I don't believe America should be a cynical country and do everything based on a calculation. I completely think America should be acting in its own self-interest, and that American self-interest should be our primary motivation for everything that we do in the world outside of our borders. That protecting our national interests is vital. But I happen to think that it is in our vital national interest to stop aggression as early as you can, because if you don't, it just gets bigger, and then you are going to end up being in the fight. You can stop aggression by having somebody believe that you're going to hit back like they did with Donald Trump, or if that doesn't work, you can slow it down by supplying weapons and technology to people who are ready to fight for their own country against aggressors. But I don't believe that we're just... I don't believe in the isolationist viewpoint. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it's practical, and I personally don't think it's moral. This, to me, is the flip side of American exceptionalism. Is that yes, it is an experiment on what freedom can do in the world if you leave people alone and let them have a dream for their own success. America's the example of what can be achieved if you give people a dream based on that. And if you are going to be the beneficiary of that dream, you should be able to back it up when it's under attack. You can sum up my position by saying I believe in a strong military and I believe in an aggressive military response to aggression, because I believe that's the best way to maintain the peace. And I also believe that when our country gives its word, then that means, and other countries do things based on our word, then we have an obligation to live up to our word, regardless of what happens to the political climate back in the United States. And for those of you not aware of it, at the fall of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is the country of Ukraine, which was under Soviet domination, had at the time of the dissolution something like 300 nuclear weapons. Were they Soviet nuclear weapons? Well, they were communist nuclear weapons. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, those weapons stayed in Ukraine. And the United States, under Bill Clinton, made an ironclad guarantee to the people of Ukraine, saying that if you surrender those weapons in the interest of denuclearizing the world, if you surrender those weapons, we will guarantee your sovereign integrity. And the Ukrainians, fools that they are, took us at our word and did surrender those nuclear weapons. Now, if they hadn't surrendered those nuclear weapons, then you have to ask yourself, would Vladimir Putin have risked an invasion knowing that Ukraine had tactical nuclear weapons and had every justification possible for using them? Hard to say. Hard to say. But I get the feeling it would have complicated his targeting equation. Battlesmith Bill, what's your view on America's word towards the Bay of Pigs? Well, I did an episode of the Cold War called Playa Girón, which is the term that the Cuban people use for the Bay of Pigs. Playa Girón is not the name. We call the Bay of Pigs invasion after the Bay of Pigs. It's a bay on the southern side of Cuba, which I didn't know until I did the research. I always thought it was on the side closest to America, but it's on the southern side of Cuba. It's called the Bay of Pigs, and there were two landing beaches there, and one of them was Playa Girón, which is how the Cubans remember it. And what Playa Girón consisted of was so for those of you unfamiliar with the history, in 1961, I want to say, 62, the United States had been looking at Fidel Castro in Cuba and his bringing communism into the Western Hemisphere. This is before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and decided that we wanted Fidel gone. And I agree with that, because Fidel's not a good guy. And neither was, come on. I'm not looking at the comments. I need to know this. I remember. Batista. So there was talk about an invasion of Cuba to be led by Cuban expatriates who had fled Cuba, but to be supported by the military of the United States of America. And in order for this plan to work, this plan was cooked up by the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower had planned this, and Eisenhower had fully expected, and so did most people, fully expected that after the 1960 election, they kept postponing this invasion. Eisenhower wanted it, and Eisenhower was convinced that Nixon was going to win the election, which looked very much like he was going to. And when you get right down to it, it's possible that he actually did. But in any event, Kennedy inherited the Bay of Pigs invasion, and Kennedy's heart was not in it. The conditions of the invasion being successful were the overthrow of the Castro government. And prior to the invasion, the CIA sent agents into Cuba to find out the mood of the Cuban people, and the mood was universally fanatically in favor of Fidel Castro. And so there was never a chance for that to succeed under any circumstances. The second those reports came back and said the Cuban people are absolutely for Castro, there's not that they want him overthrown, they will fight to the death to preserve him. The second that happened, the Bay of Pigs invasion should have been called off, but it wasn't. And so what we got kind of backdoor chicken shit diplomacy. We told the Cubans that we would back them, but when push came to shove, we didn't. So the Cubans go in. The force was called a Brigade something 3619 something like that. And they went in, and they were supposed to have air support, and they didn't get it. The Cubans had antiquated P-80 shooting stars, which were the first jets we used in Korea, and they were first operational jets that we fielded. They were crummy jets. And because there was no air cover, the Cuban P-80s had a field day. They had their finest hour, shot down all kinds of these, I want to say B-26s that the insurrectionists, the Bay of Pigs invaders were using, and it was just it's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe because we should not have made that move in the first place, and we should have been in or out. This is always where America goes off the rails, either in or out. I believe the Vietnam War could have been ended in 4 months if we had been in. But by the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. This fun fact. I have to get working on this. I was approached by PragerU to do a segment for their Presidents series. So, would you like to do one of the episodes on the presidents? I said, I'd love to. I said, who do I get? And they said, you get Lyndon Johnson. I said, okay. I got a few things about Lyndon Johnson. And I have to have that script in by the end of this month, so we'll shoot it in July. So it's a long story, but basically the short form of why Vietnam was such a catastrophe is because Kennedy hired Bob McNamara to be his defense secretary. Kennedy was a blue blood Brahmin who went to Harvard, and so was McNamara. Kennedy had no inferiority complex towards McNamara's intellect. They were both golden boys, and Kennedy put McNamara in his place. But when Kennedy was assassinated and you get Lyndon Johnson believed that McNamara was a genius and that his entire approach to fighting war worked. McNamara, to his credit, when he was approached for the job of defense secretary by John F. Kennedy, he turned him down and said, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm not qualified for the job. And Kennedy said, well, I'm not qualified for president either. We'll do it together. But the thing about McNamara was before he became defense secretary, McNamara was celebrated in America, throughout America, as a business genius who was changing American business for the better. McNamara was the first of these guys that did things like efficiency experts. McNamara increased manufacturing by saying, well, you've got this one guy walking all the way over here, why not just put him over there, this kind of thing. And so they thought that you could apply that to warfighting. To some degree, that kind of thing can be useful, but not to the degree that McNamara did it. So this was news until I did the research on the Cold War. Bob McNamara, after Kennedy was assassinated and Johnson was trying to figure out what could be done in Vietnam to stop communist aggression, McNamara had a computer program And he would enter into this computer program the number of troops and an estimate of their quality, and then the computer would crunch the numbers, because that's what Bob McNamara was. He was a number cruncher. And it would spit out a piece of paper, and McNamara would read that piece of paper back to Lyndon Johnson. And it went something to the effect of, if you want to capture X town, Da Nang, it will take 80,000 troops in order to capture it. It'll take 120,000 troops to keep it, and all of these numbers. And these printouts came out of a computer, which was brand new at the time. And so, hey, all right, computer says 80,000 troops, let's do it. And then he turned the war into a data collection exercise. Not a war, data collection exercise. We have this many men, they have that many men. What's the body count? What's the kill ratio? If we're killing them 3-1, we'll win the war, or whatever the number is. We never fight that way. We've never thought our people were expendable, and we've never. We've always believed in overwhelming firepower, but we've never been willing to trade baseball cards on that ratio. And so for the entire war, Johnson kept trying to tune the equation. He kept thinking that somehow he could convince North Vietnam that he could negotiate them into giving up. And they weren't about to give up. So we fought the war as a series of proportional responses. The rules of engagement in Vietnam are beyond belief. The short form was that we had jets that didn't have guns on them because we had missiles. And we had a Sparrow missile with a PK, a probability of kill of 7%, and a Sidewinder with a better PK of something around 11%. That means that if we fired 100 Sparrows, 7 of them would hit their target. That's how bad those missiles were, those first-generation missiles. But Johnson said, in order to engage a North Vietnamese fighter, you must first visually identify the fighter. Now, Sparrow missiles are ranged out to, maybe 15, 20 miles. And once you get inside the range of a Sparrow missile, then these lightweight Soviet fighters with guns, we didn't have guns because we didn't need them anymore because we had missiles. So the advantage that we had, which was range, is taken off the equation immediately in order to meet Johnson's rules of engagement. I guess he didn't want us shooting on any Russian airplanes. So the U.S. pilots had to visually identify the enemy pilots, and by the time they did, it was usually too late. We were not allowed to follow North Vietnamese aircraft back to their bases. We were not allowed to bomb their bases or hit their bases. We were not allowed to hit trucks that were parked on the side of the road. We were not allowed to attack aircraft that had their landing gear down in the process of landing. It's absolutely insane. And the rules on the ground were similar. If we wanted a fire mission, if we had guys that were under fire and we needed to bring some artillery in, we were required to contact a group of local Vietnamese and often very corrupt village elders who had to be notified about this. We had to provide advance warning that this artillery strike was coming in or whatever the case may be. It's literally, it's nuts. And then it had to go up to the top and be approved. And when I say to the top, it didn't have to go to a major, not even the general, not even the Westmoreland. It had to go to Johnson. Johnson had to approve every single fire mission from the basement of the White House. It's absolutely batshit crazy. Batshit crazy. Towards the end of the war, when Nixon took over, hang on, he brought in, was it Creighton Abrams, I want to say? Westmoreland was the perfect commander for the Johnson-McNamara war. Okay, what's the kill ratio? So if we have this hill and we kill 80 Americans taking the hill, but as long as we kill 500 Vietnamese, that's a win, right? Yes. Well, any hill that kills 80 Americans is not a win. So finally, Creighton Abrams comes along under Nixon, and we're through the process of Vietnamization, where we're basically taking our troops out of the country and letting the South Vietnamese handle more and more of this. And Abrams comes along with the plan. He basically said this. He said, look, Mr. President, we've got enough armor in country now and enough men right now without adding any. In fact, we can keep walking the numbers down. But right now, we've got enough force for me to take an armored column up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Just go right up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, use all of our strength. We have air power, we've got armor, and we're going to go right up the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we're going to park the tanks in the town square in the center of Hanoi, and we're going to dictate peace agreement to the North Vietnamese. And if he'd tried it 6 months earlier, he probably could have gotten approval for it. But imagine that. There's Creighton Abrams with a plan to win the war, not to perpetuate the war, to win it. Win it. We're going to go up the Ho Chi Minh Trail with tanks, air cover over the top, troops behind. We're going to just smash through anything they throw at us. Anytime we face the Vietnamese, either the NVA or the Viet Cong, anytime we faced them, we just wiped them out. So we're just going to go, and they're not going to be able to harass us. We're going to move fast. We're just going to bring our supplies with us. We just go up there, and we're going to park the tanks in Hanoi. We're going to say these are our conditions, and if he had tried that, well, certainly if he tried it in even as late as probably 71, 70, certainly he would have won the war, and won it in such a way that the North Vietnamese wouldn't have been willing to test the peace the way they did about a year later. So, yeah, I'm not aware of any war that's ever been fought as badly as the Vietnam War. There's just no, forget justifying it. There's no understanding it. It was horrific. I mean, the reason Operation Bolo was certainly one of my favorite episodes in history. My favorite episode of the Cold War, I want to say, or second favorite. But Operation Bolo wouldn't have worked if it hadn't been for the fact that the reason we suckered the North Vietnamese into bringing up their MiG-21s and shooting down half of their MiG-21 Air Force was because we were flying missions that took off at the same time of day every day. They used the same radio call signs. They flew at the same altitudes on the same headings with the same landmarks at the same time of day after day after day. And I think I said in the Cold War series, you didn't even need to put up surface-to-air missiles. You could have just put up nets. You could have just hung nets. That's how predictable these things were. We're coming in on this heading, and once we bomb this target, we're going out on that heading. And all you have to do is just put everything you got along those lines, and we were just getting annihilated. I don't know how many aircraft we lost in, I think it was April of 67 or 68, I've forgotten now, 67 I guess. But it was something like 60 or 70 jets shot down in a month, our jets. And the air-to-air ratio was claimed to be 2-to-1 in our favor. It was probably closer to 1-to-1. In Korea, it was 14-to-1. With the F-15, it's, what is it now? The number changes. Hang on a second. As a result of John Boyd and the Fighter Mafia, now our air-to-air kill ratio for the F-15 fighter, which was not in Vietnam, designed as a result of Vietnam, changes, but basically it's about 104-0. We had a 2-to-1 kill ratio, maybe a 1-to-1 kill ratio in Vietnam. The F-15 is 104-0. That includes other countries. That's just the Eagle. So there is a way to fight a war, and there's a way to lose a war, and we managed to do both of them. Red Force says we had to deal with the similar rules of engagement in Afghanistan under Obama. If U.S. troops were fired upon by Taliban snipers from a village or town, they were told not to return fire and keep moving. You know, I'm sorry to say this. I really am. But essentially, democratic administrations destroy world peace because they advertise the crippling of America's political power, military power. When we were fighting ISIS under Obama, we saw a very large ISIS had to come up with the money so that they could continue to blow up Parisian nightclubs and murder people, execute them with det cord around their necks and all the rest of that stuff, put pilots in cages, set them on fire. And ISIS needed money to do that. So what they had was a significant part of Iraq under their control. Under Obama, it got bigger and bigger and bigger until they finally, their area was a couple of different countries. And the way they got their money was to take oil from those countries and sell it, which is what we were accused of doing. But when we sat on the fields at Kuwait, the oil fields of Kuwait, richest oil fields in the world at the time, we put out the fires and we went home. But ISIS was loading that oil onto convoys. And on several occasions, these convoys are heading to the Gulf, and U.S. intelligence has it. And they're asking for permission to strike this convoy, give them one of those highway of death kind of send-offs, give them something to think about. And the Obama administration said that you can attack the convoy if you give them 45 minutes warning, and something else like that. And guess what? We gave them 45 minutes warning, and they dispersed the convoy, and so they kept on getting their money. Donald Trump, on the second day of office, uses the largest non-nuclear bomb we have in the inventory to clear a couple guys out of a cave, which was overkill, but that's exactly the point. It's like, we're not playing this anymore. Boom. These are all data points. Look, if it turned out that the liberal argument was right, then that's the position I would take. Mirshab Dark says we put out the fires and went home, but we and our allies still control those oil fields and reap the benefits from them. Our allies control those oil fields, but the United States doesn't control those oil fields. We don't own those oil fields. We could have annexed the territory, could have made it a territory of the United States. We could have taken all that oil out of there for free, but we don't. So I don't know what the point of that is. When you say we and our allies, then yes, the people that live in that country control those countries' revenues. That's what we went there to restore. So, yeah. Fiery Texas says maybe next time we really should go and steal the oil. I was completely shocked and utterly impressed. In fact, floored, because I lived through the Arab oil embargo in 1973. And I'm so used to the United States being energy dependent, but during the Trump administration, we became an exporter of oil. We exported oil. Do you get that? We had domestically all of the oil that this country needs, energy, including natural gas, and enough on a yearly basis to sell it. And the idea that we would be dependent on OPEC or anybody else for that matter from this point forward. So what's the first thing that Joe Biden does when he comes to office? Shuts down oil pipelines, shuts down new drilling permits, restricts existing permits. There's nothing that the Obama or Biden administrations hasn't done that makes any sense from an American perspective. Makes perfect sense if you are an enemy of the United States. Then all of their actions make absolutely perfect sense. Yeah, we have a strategic reserve that needs a filling, right? So Joe Biden released vast amounts of gasoline from our strategic reserve, which we decided to keep after the Arab oil embargo for a rainy day. But Biden just let a lot of it out in order to lower gas prices because he was taking a big political hit from that. So once again, politicians doing what politicians do. You know, we're going to give them Social Security funds. Here's billions, if not $1 trillion worth of people's income checks, paychecks. Here it comes in every month. Here's more money, more money, more money. And it's coming to the Social Security fund, so it has to be held in sacred reserve because it's simply resting there to be paid back to the people who paid it in when they get to the end of their working career. And they spent it all. They just took all the money out of that account and replaced it with IOUs. And they spent it. And they spent it to get elected by buying people things so they get voted for. It's all treason. And I'd like to see some penalties for treason being enforced. So I know I said I'd get to questions, but I think I've covered about everything I need to cover today. I will, if you could, if I didn't get to them, please, I understand a couple were about the topic. I'm all talked out on the topic. If it turns out that you had a question in the comments today, please repeat it next week and put second attempt or whatever and try to get to that right away. Anyway, this was civil. I saw a few people saying I hadn't thought things that way, and I'm always learning things. The reason I wanted to have this conversation was because I thought very deeply about last conversation. And I spent a week asking myself, Bill, what if you're wrong about this, Bill? You know, what if you're wrong about all this? What if you're wrong? I do that a lot. And so I just decided to have a talk about it. Do we know what, Marisha wants to know, do we know what Spirit and Putin actually thought and believed, or is this just speculation? How do we know he wasn't just a hostage, as much of a hostage and a slave? You don't get to be in the household of the two most paranoid people in the history of the world who executed wives, brothers, mothers, fathers, sons, their own relatives with impunity. You don't have that position where you can kill them all in one night unless they are 100% certain of your commitment to the cause. So, no, I do not have transcripts of what Spirit and Putin said to Vladimir. But the fact that he was the personal house servant of Lenin for the for essentially for his entire life as leader of the Soviet Union and for Stalin's is telling me that he is reliably political. And not just what comes out of his mouth, by the way. You can also count on the fact that both Lenin and Stalin were keeping tabs on him on every single word that he ever said was recorded. Have no doubt about it. So I'm fairly confident about that. Anyway, so I'll be there in Oshkosh coming in on the Starship. I don't remember what day that is, middle of July, I want to say. So we'll be there. Bert's going, I'm going, and we'll see. Next time I'll try to pick a subject that's not nearly so complex, and I can get to the interaction with the comments much faster. I feel bad about people having to leave, but just struck me that this is an extremely complicated picture, and I probably oversold it, but I wanted to be clear. Okay. Marisha's last thing. My future brother-in-law is going to flight school. Any advice for him? Yes, I have ironclad advice for him, Marisha. Tell him I'd be happy to talk about this in person. I 100% believe this with my heart. If he absolutely should start flying in gliders. Absolutely. That is the single greatest advice I can give to any pilot in the world. Get a glider rating. Not only will it teach him how to fly better, he'll learn the relationship between pitch and airspeed. He'll learn all kinds of things. He doesn't have to worry about the radio. He'll learn stick and rudder skills. He'll learn how to put the nose down when you get in trouble. He'll learn all those things. And if he ever loses his engine, he will have the same experience I did, which is say, holy shit, I just lost my engine. Oh, wait a minute, I'm a glider pilot. That's right, I'm a glider pilot. I've got 80 hours in gliders. I've made 225 landings in gliders. This time with the engine not moving, it's going to be 226 glider landings. Cannot recommend it highly enough. Tranquility Base USA, what a great name. I've really enjoyed getting to see you again on these live streams. In many ways, you've not changed since those days in the Coral Gables High School lunch table in 1974 in a good way. Okay, I gotta know. That's now I'm going to have to crack out the yearbooks. Um, can you give me a hint there, Tranquility Base, USA? Not changed since those days in the Coral Gables High School lunch table in 1974. In a good way. I feel like I've changed a lot. And if I was back at the Coral Gables High School lunch table right now, uh, I would own that school. I would own it. I would have an endless series of dates with all of the Gablettes, and I would have had my pick, just like that. That's what I've learned. Hey, Dave, good to see you. Thank you very much. It's always great to hear people. CG, HS, the baddest band from east to west. Yeah, I know the words to the alma mater. I'm not going to sing them here, but there you go. All right, so this show's made possible by the members at BillWhittle.com who continue to play ball and have a great time. Hey, Dave, it's really, 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 really good to see you. Thank you. It's good memories. Probably remember the purple sweatshirt that I wore every single bloody day. It's hung a piece of filthy long sleeve purple clothing on a skeleton and pretty much got an idea of what you're looking at. It'd be good to talk to you about that, Dave. I don't really remember much about that. I've always felt like you said I had insight back then. I just always felt like, looking back on it, I just kind of feel like I was mold that was kind of growing underneath some of the lockers in the hallway. But we did have some fun, I guess. Horkheimer, yeah, I'll do that too. I will. Thank you very much. Good to see you. Thanks again to the members for making this possible. I'll put my glasses back on so I can see what the hell we're doing here. So that'll do it for this edition of the Stratosphere Lounge, made possible by members at BillWhittle.com. It's time to say goodnight to our friends on YouTube. So good night, YouTube, and we'll see you Monday for Stratosphere Studio.